You ever play a game that you spend too much time on? I've seen some people complain that games are too long, or talk about game length, and kind of fail to specify the axes of various long games. There's single player games, story games, that you play once and are fairly long. Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption, BioWare games. You generally play these once, and they generally last dozens of hours at least. Then there are games that are less like a story, less like watching a season of a television show or maybe multiple seasons, and games that are more like an activity, a sport, somewhat. All those Call of Duty matches on multiplayer are less akin to television and more akin to casual games of basketball played on the street, games of repeated contests. And those games are often cited as long games. MMOs are kind of in this mix of a genre where you have story, sure, but isn't most of the activity a repeated grind? And isn't it not mostly story you're playing, but mostly the game? Games are weird in their length. Now, I think there's value in talking about length in game, simply because that a lot of people translate their investment in a game for bang for buck, that they spent a lot of time in a game, therefore it was good. I tend to not agree with this 100%, where just because you spend a lot of time in a game doesn't necessarily make it better than a game you spent less time in. One of my favorite games of 2019 was called Sayonara Wild Hearts. Lasts about an hour. But boy, what a glorious hour to play. That being said, one of my other favorite games of 2019 is the current version of Path of Exile, The Conquerors of the Atlas. As a side note, the logo here is awful, and for one very particular reason. This does not line up with the bottom. That's just awful, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You're welcome. Path of Exile is a game I have not put merely 1 hour in. My Steam playtime says something along the lines of 3,500. Over the course of half a decade. The game came out in 2013, and it is currently the start of 2020. Oof. Path of Exile is more of an activity game than a story game, though there is story to be had. I think you could play this game single player and enjoy it. Today I just wanted to be talking about my thoughts on the current state of the game and where it's started and where it's come to. I think the first thing to note that is not only a feature, but also a talking point. The game is free to play. When the founders of Path of Exile started out, they knew they wanted to make a game based off a game they loved, Diablo 2. They saw that the market at the time was not producing titles that properly succeeded Diablo 2. The market was kind of empty on the looting action RPG genre. This was mid 2000s. They started work on Path of Exile, and they always knew from the start they wanted it to be free. This is before free-to-play was really a thing, though. So they were one of the first kind of progenitors of a free-to-play model. Not entirely, but they saw the environment around them where there was a lot of predatory free-to-play practices and decided they didn't want to do any of that. And while there are some elements of quality of life in Path of Exile that I do think make a significant impact on play experience, it doesn't really kick in until later in the playthrough. And most of the expensive transactions you can purchase in the game are purely cosmetic, which is another thing to think about. So the game's free, and more importantly, it's free to play. It's a free-to-play money model. It was crowdsourced at the start on its own site. It had overwhelming success on the crowdsourcing. They had a bunch of supporter tiers, all the way up to $1,000, and that was one of the more popular tiers. Funnily enough, they found out that people who spent that money weren't necessarily super rich as much as they were saving up for the purchase, which I find interesting. The game is a project of passion, I guess not simply from the developers, who really banked everything on the success of this game. They worked out of their garage, were really close to spending their savings, and came out on top. But it's also a passion of the fans who play it. Like, you don't spend that much money on a game. Of course, my phone is talking, but you don't spend that much money on a game and just because you have a frivolous expenditure. At least I think most of the people who play this don't. I spent a lot of money in this game in addition to a lot of time, and I could say that's about right. I didn't use it to buy better quality of life. I didn't use it to buy like experience boosters in a game where you level. I didn't buy in-game points to get better gear or anything. This game doesn't let you buy that. I did spend some points on a stash tab, which is a laughably limited amount of gain and at player advantage. It's more of quality of life than actual power, which was good. They made an April Fool's even one year about what it means to win in Path of Exile, where they basically sold these April Fool's fireworks that said you won on the chat window. Let's log into the game and explain Path of Exile some. Path of Exile plays like a game called Diablo, and specifically Diablo 2. It's a top-down action RPG, as vague and undescriptive as the name action RPG means. One of the things I really like about Path of Exile is its setting. It's not the main reason I keep coming back to the game. I'll get to that in a moment. But it is something that undeniably has charm. Path of Exile isn't set in a medieval world. If anything, it is set in a fantasy take on a early colonialist era time. Not necessarily when there was gunpowder and muskets, but when there was still exploration of new continents and fallen civilizations and new ones risen. It's made by a New Zealand developer, whose only game is this one. Tellingly titled Grinding Gear Games. when said this game had microtransactions, by the way, these are some of them. And we'll go into some of the thoughts on that shortly. So, New Zealand, I think, has a lot of influence in this game. One of the first areas actually uses textures, I believe, from beaches in New Zealand. I often joke that Path of Exile is a take on kind of grimdark Indonesian lands and stories. There's a running theme of kind of invasive empires rising and falling into a cursed land, and you could flippantly joke that this is grimdark Australia. But that undersells it. This game has this great, like, fantasy Polynesian take on it. There's direct parallels. There's to some real life elements. For instance, there's a tribe in this game called the Kauri, and they are, if you look into it, are fairly obviously a take on the Maori tribes in New Zealand, the native residents there. So, I think the thing that I like about the theme and the setting in Path of Exile is that it's unique to itself and not simply another medieval or steampunk generic setting. Here, let's cast a spell and destroy some enemies. So these are the beaches, for instance, that apparently look very similar to New Zealand beaches, minus the hungry cannibals and impaled corpses and campfires. The driftwood's there, though. Path of Exile starts you stranded on one of these beaches. You are kicked off from a ship, the titular Exile. You fight an undead enemy. There are zombies in this game, but unlike Diablo 2, they're given more reason of existence than simply being a villain of hell. No, that's the thing I like about Path of Exile. It explores the idea of kind of abuse of resources and power, where zombies are a aftermath effect of a great cataclysmic feat of mankind, where a breach into a unknowable evil, if you will. An empire tried to take harness of it and ended up destroying their empire instead of actually ascending. This happens multiple times in the history of Path of Exile. The unknowable creature is called the Beast. It's actually a creature that isn't inside a mountain, but is kind of a living mountain. It's really cool. I think another thing to think about is the music of Path of Exile. It sounds a lot like Matt Ullman's work in Diablo 2 at the start, especially in the first few acts. But I think it comes into its own even at the start, where it has these slight tonal shifts and stuff that reminds me that this is not copying Diablo 2, it's taking inspiration from it. So we go into this mine where people have been mining skill gems, or virtue gems, that have grant magical powers, more or less. And the chief alchemist, if you will, though they call it thaumaturgy in this game, betrayed his empire to try to ascend into some menacing form of godhood, as one does. And in this impenetrable shell lies, for instance, one of my favorite areas in the game, with one of my favorite parts of music. Look at this gory stuff. Now, Path of Exile just really manages to be this dark, gritty setting. That's another thing it does that it really was inspired by Diablo 2 for. Incidentally, I'm wasting a lot of valuable prophecies, these purple quests, that I should have saved before I went into this area. Path of Exile's story is interesting. In a talk at the company's own convention, ExileCon of last year, one of the developers mentioned how telling the story was like trying to tell a story through a encyclopedia and a bunch of broken text. And how do you make a narrative out of that? It actually is a very similar format to Diablo 2's, except without the cutscenes, which is a challenge. You piece together a story by talking to a bunch of characters with exclamation marks on their head. They are given a lot of dialogue vignettes. These aren't dialogue options. They are simply monologues the characters give describing the game and the game world and your general place in it. You start off as an exile, but eventually transcend that role and become, a slayer of gods as power progression goes. You begin on a lone beach, just simply scrounging for food and finding a way to better land for your cast out lot. Coming across a nemesis early on of the name Piety that gives you some motivation for following through for the rest of the early part of the game. Piety teases you with first by blocking the entrance to the forest that has better food and such. You go through a cavern occupied by an ancient siren named Merveil to find the other way inland, impressing the exiles in Lionized Watch, the outpost that they live in. One of the characters in that outpost says an interesting line of, please consider, when even monsters fear you, what have you become? Or something to that sense. And that's a theme in this game, the notion of obtaining power at the price of humanity, even within your own playable character. It never resolves that conflict because this is a game that's meant to be played indefinitely, and that's where its free-to-play ties in yet again, where because this game is is one that you play for free, it's one that you're meant to be playing indefinitely. And that's why people have put so many hours into a game like this. It's not designed as a single experience, or even a replayable single experience. It's meant to be played kind of as a living game. And unfortunately, that kind of means that some story threads either don't get resolved at all, or get resolved but the game keeps going, kind of mooting their points. For instance, when you beat the final boss, you're honored as transcending your exile and finally being a hero. But there's more. There's always more. I think the latest story arc added to the game has a interesting conclusion to this. It's pretty well written, but we'll get to that in a moment. So I'm going through a low-level area. My character is incredibly overpowered for this area, by the way. It is a leveling RPG. And as such, somebody that's level 94 in a level 8-9 zone is simply just going to destroy anything it walks past and not take a hint of damage. That's just how this game's designed. But I wanted to walk by here to show Piety walking through. Oh wait, never mind. Actually, this makes a better point. Because this game's always online, certain story events simply don't happen for a character again. Um, Sometimes they don't even happen for a whole account. Literally, there are moments in this game you can only experience once per email address that you sign into to make your own Path of Exile playable account on their free-to-play game. In this case, my character originally walked past here. Mysterious woman named Piety walks up and mocks you. You follow a bloody trail. This area is always empty, which is a nice thematic build-up. Follow the corpses, and eventually you are led to Brutus, who's going to die immediately. Along the way, you can pick up lore books. This is where the encyclopedia comes in, where it's like reading broken parchments of history, and you're given clues as to what became the story. Some people call this lore. I think it's more than that. I think it's actual story given to the game, just written in a backwards framework. So, there's an event, for instance, in Act 3 where you meet an unlockable 7th character, and you unlock her for the rest of your entire playthroughs of the game, but it also means that you only get to see that cutscene and that dialogue once. That just kind of sucks. But you have to compromise that because this is a living game. This is a game that is free to play and not one that is a one-time purchase, and that's one of the consequences, really. That some stuff is just a living service. Path of Exile is a living game. Can't say if this is good or bad. I think it's a little bit of both. It's bad because you miss out on certain things, like maybe you liked one version of the game, but it got patched, and now suddenly the mechanics of one particular format of the game are gone or shifted, the balance has changed. On the other, that means the game's continually supported, and you keep it fresh. As long as the game has kind of the revenue supporting it, which is where that free-to-play is so essential. This game would not be what it is today were it not for the continued support it gets. It's just, that's what it is. This would be Path of Exile 7 at this point. And that's just a shame. Need to figure out how to ban people quickly. So, what to say? So yeah, this game would not be what it is based on, if it was simply based on a one-time purchase. Now, it could be played offline, and you wouldn't have to always have a consistent connection or worry about the servers going up or down. Thankfully, the servers have been pretty well maintained, all things considered. But I think the main loss is not on offline mode. It's that you kind of can't play this historically. You can't go back to Path of Exile 1.0 and just boot it up and have a good old time. You're coming in to Path of Exile version 3.9, eventually 3.1, 3.10, 3.11, 4.0, and it'll be a different game each time. For some, this is a good thing. I think in some way it's good for me too. In other ways, it's kind of sad that we lose a bit of history each time the game goes up with a new bit of content. This particular update, they've added a character named Tane Octavius. He's just a small side game in Path of Exile where organs drop from various enemies. You assemble them in a giant vial, and fight a boss made of other enemies. It's a build-a-boss mechanic. He also looks like a nautical explorer. Anyways, what's going to happen to him in 3.10? We don't know, at least not yet. And what's going to happen to them in 3.11? Can I rely on the game keeping all these cast of characters with their separate mini games and such? No. It'll be very different. In 1 year in Path of Exile, all of this will be very different. Who knows what's to come with the future in that sense. That's one thing that differentiates this from Diablo 2, other than kind of its own themes and ideas. Simply that Path of Exile is a living game. But a living game for a single-player story. Now, I said that this game is kind of an activity as well as a story, because while it has a story, 10 acts long actually, the years of iteration on the game has added not only added a fourth act, but then another 6. Started on release with 3 acts, ended with 10. Also has what they call now an epilogue. This is an endless mode that they have, and even this has been changed over the years. This used to be originally just items that dropped after you beat the game, called maps. They would mysteriously drop from enemies. You run a map, the maps have a chance to drop the next level's worth, and so on, all the way up from 1 to 16. Then they added a map for those maps, a constellation-looking atlas, and this added this whole subsystem of, well, in order to get the fungal hollow, I have to run the beach, and then in order to get this channel map, I'm going to have to run a flooded mine, or a cell, or an infested valley. And then they recently, as of a month ago, completely changed how this part worked. Instead of starting in one of 4 corners on the edge, you started in the center and went outwards. Instead of maps being a fixed level, they change based on these watchstones you acquire from bosses you defeat in this endgame. The endgame is incredibly extensive. You can spend dozens, if not hundreds of hours simply doing that. That's not the only thing you can do in Path of Exile that extends its longevity. The other is this idea of replayability, that you can create a new character and make it completely unique from a prior one. There are 7 classes in Path of Exile, 7 character archetypes. Each fitting kind of a fantasy trope: a paladin, a witch, a barbarian, marauder. But the thing is, Path of Exile's most notorious feature, being its passive skill tree, lets you kind of customize characters in a truly astronomical amount of permutations. Character starts in one of these hubcap wheels. For instance, this is where the Marauder starts. They share this skill tree. But from there, you go into this giant web of a thing and pick skills 1 level at a time, 1 circle for 1 level at a time. You only get 100 levels. There are over 13,000 skills to pick from and various permutations to go through. There is literally no way you could make a character for every type of permutation on the tree. I think that would number in digits, and I think you would have to use scientific notation to formulate the amount of combinations that you can make for characters in this game. Not saying that every combination makes sense, many won't, but humans could intuit what is good for their character, and there's lots of ways to invent different things to complement your skills. In an interesting turnaround from Diablo 2, where you gained your abilities from a skill tree and you gained your passive benefits from items that you put into your gear, the items you put into your gear in this game are your skills, and the skill tree is passive benefits. If I open up my inventory, you see these little gems that look awfully lot like various flavors of Skittles. We have the lime, the blueberry, and the cherry, I guess. Strawberry, probably. Well, these are skills. One of these is called Vortex, and then it is linked on this piece of chest armor with 5 other skills that enhance the Vortex. Some of them just make it so the Vortex doesn't directly freeze enemies. Some of them make the skill last longer. Some of them might make the skill have a bigger area. Some might make it have a smaller area but do more damage. So on and so forth. I won't go into all the mechanics of Path of Exile, and in fact I'll barely touch on any of them because the game is incredibly extensive. For instance, why is my red health glow... What should be a red health glow all grayed out? It's because I've used a skill called Blood Magic that spends life instead of mana to reserve a toggable spell that cuts into a portion of your mana. In this case, now it's life that's being reserved. And now I have giving me a chance to cast an extra aura, and I use a defensive ability called Energy Shield that cannot be healed via potions, but just regenerates automatically if you don't get hit for a little bit, to allow myself to essentially still survive even though I have all my life reserved. With the added twist that there is one damage type that can bypass Energy Shield, but I'm wearing the chest armor that changes that rule. This is an example of just like one idea of a character. Not even all of an idea of a character, just a little tidbit of features that you can tweak your character with. That whole mechanic is called the low life idea, where you go in low life and get more auras and maybe use a major passive benefit on the tree that lets you do more damage when you're on low life. You can see how the synergies build up and up and up. But ultimately, this is a game where you point and click. It's Diablo 2 in many aspects. You pick a character, you point and click it around a open-ended world. You click to move, you click to cast attack spells, you click to attack monsters. This iterates on Diablo 2 in that there's also hotkeys that you use to cast even more different spells. Maybe I'm summoning a golem, maybe I'm casting a vortex, or casting with another hotkey a cold snap spell. Diablo 2 originally just had you have to swap between things to right click with. Well, think about Path of Exile. So it has its most notorious skill tree, and ultimately the skill tree is not the depth of complexity as much as the rest of the game combined with it is. None of this by itself is that crazy. A lot of these nodes are simply stat boosts to one of your 3 core attributes. Some of these, the rest of them are just enhancements to the rest of the mechanics of the game. You might have a skill that drains some of your mana the longer you hold on to it, called a channeling skill. This little wheel here affects that. Some things address mana, some things address life. A lot of nodes address life for that matter. Some address this energy shield. But it's not just the passive tree, it's also planning the gear. How am I going to get my elemental resistances to their maximum limit? How am I going to deal with chaos damage? How am I going to deal with regenerating my health during the middle of a fight? How am I going to deal with being able to move? Well, I'll attach a skill to one of my gears, to one bit of my gear that lets me do a quick dash, but has a little bit of a cooldown. How am I going to deal with making enemies weaker? Well, I'll cast a frost spell and then use Vortex on them. I'll drop a frost bomb and then use Vortex. How am I going to make enemies take even less damage? Well, I'll use a skill that makes enemies take more damage from an element I didn't hit them with, and then cast spells that hit them with an element, and then cast the Vortex that doesn't count as a hit, but instead drains life over time. So on, so forth, so on, so forth. How am I going to craft this gear? Oh, what a pool, what a well of a subject that is. Gear in Path of Exile is why you play it again and again, I think, more than anything. It's not just that you make different characters, it's collecting the gear to make those characters. I would not be able to do this low life build without this chest piece that I collected. And this amulet also helps a lot. And then I have to collect gear that adds the energy shield that I need to get a defensive set. And this game is dedicated. It is a love letter to stat management and gearing more than anything else. The combat's great in many ways. It's, a lot of absurd abilities that you can cast, cover this entire screen with various vortexes and such. But ultimately, it's the fact that this thing has chaos damage that doesn't bypass energy shield, that this lets me not be immune to stun, that this gives me resistances, this lets me get extra energy shield from my body armor, that this belt lets me socket a jewel into it that normally I could only socket into my passive skill tree. That's right, the passive skill tree can have things socketed into it, and those things can even be unique and have special abilities. That's the appeal of Path of Exile, or one of the largest appeals. After all, the name of the developer of this game is Grinding Gear Games. Could it not be any more obvious that this is a game about collecting gear? It's much like Magic the Gathering, the card game, where you open up packs of cards and are looking for good spells to put in your deck and say, oh, this mythic creature I can summon is perfect for my blue mana deck. I make the comparison to Magic not incidentally either. One of the lead co-founders of the game was directly inspired by Magic the Gathering. There are the blue, red, and green attributes, and there are blue, red, and green parts of the tree, much like there are different flavors of mana in Magic the Gathering, and that collecting cards is much like collecting items in Path of Exile. So, really, to go back to the length of gameplay, this character has invested a lot of time in the game. I've played nearly 3 days purely of gameplay in this character. They have done a lot of epilogue stuff. Really, only the first 10 or so hours were spent on the story mode. The epilogue is where most of the game starts. The thing is, this is not the only character I've played that has these hours marked in. One playthrough is the length of a fairly lengthy RPG. But add to that this game, over the years, resets its story mode, its online community, for a different seasonal league that essentially you are given, incentivized even, to start a new character and try to build up a stash of items that you can keep and share between the characters you make in that season. And that's what keeps people coming back to Path of Exile. Just to try the new decks of cards that were released on the hottest new take of the game. And I think that's and that would not have happened without Path of Exile being a free-to-play living game. Or at least it wouldn't be so feature-driven. Building a boss would not have been a thing if this was just a single release game. That would have been the reset of the ladder might simply have been just one tiny mechanic instead. There is a problem in addition to maybe the game not being the same as it was before with this living format. The other issue, to me at least, is that the game gets complicated. The game already was complicated. Look at this skill tree. Look at these skill gem setups. Look at this item. But in addition to that, the game just kept keeping the features of its little seasonal items back and put them into the game permanently in some format or another. These characters all come from a different league. They all were introduced as various mechanics. Crafting bench was added in early on into the game, the second major update, along with this personal housing stuff that lets me rearrange items. Oh, I misset this. That's awful. A bonus final boss in the end game was added in an expansion, where you take special fragments that drop in the maps and put them in a big circle to create a bonus area. The ability to cause special quest events to happen through prophecies. This was a mechanic added to the game. None of these mechanics by themselves are too complicated, but it builds up. None of these mechanics really change the core of the game too much, but as an aggregate, it just adds so much complexity. There's so many things that you can do. Many of it's not that you need to do, but you can do. Do you want to run an infinite dungeon?
A familiar fact.
Do you want to capture beasts like a Pokemon game and then slay them unlike a Pokemon game? To craft items? Do you want to play tower defense, collecting special oils that make your rings and amulets better? Do you want to build a boss? Do you want to deal with a goddamn conspiracy board? Honest to God conspiracy board. Is that not just outright admitting that this game's about complexity in some way? They went overboard with this at one point. Arguably, they added a area as complex as this Atlas of Worlds in a league called Synthesis, where there was numerous countless items that dropped on the ground that you would synthesize in a device, and you'd play this little tile matching game to create a dungeon of your own, and you had to race to the finish. They all but scrapped that because people complained it was just too much, it was too rushed, because these updates come every 3 months. These huge bits of game. Playing a game for nearly 3 days in the course of 3 months isn't too crazy, but going back at again and again, there's so much added each time that they kind of laid off it after a while. So, I think my worry about Path of Exile is that it'll grow into something I won't like to play anymore. But so far, so good. They're going to come out with a game. They're going to come out with a quote Path of Exile 2 unquote, where they're essentially adding a second story mode to the game that's a direct follow-up to parts 1 and 2. Now, they're keeping parts 1 and 2, but they're totally rehauling the way these skilled links work. Probably for the best, but it'll totally change the way the game balance works. And maybe people who like the original game balance will be sad about that. Though the community response in general is good riddance on some aspects. Hopefully they'll keep the integrity of this current system while not breaking the game in other ways. I know there hasn't been much combat gameplay footage, so let's talk about another thing. Path of Exile starts a fairly slow and reasonably paced game. By the end, it's hard to tell what's going on. Also, this game is brutal on a solid-state hard drive, or a standard hard drive. You basically want a solid state. This is the load times that I play with are rather obnoxious. So, you can even craft the dungeons that drop. What a concept. It's just so crazy. Portals open up. These are things you learn that you only get 6 town portals in the end game to do a single dungeon. But really the game has plenty of flaws. And sometimes plenty of concerns that aren't necessarily flaws. Monsters die fairly instantaneously by the end of the game. Even the yellow, rare mini-boss monsters. These should be mini-bosses, yet they are
the creator
regular characters. So, that character that appeared there is part of the storyline of the endgame that was added recently. Everybody had a time figuring out how to do the endgame, including myself. Notice part of the Atlas is red now. It is influenced by Baron the Crusader, who went mad going grinding the endgame. Yes, even Path of Exile makes a joke about the whole grinding and continual exploration of an endless content. Literally, the final boss, after the final boss, one of the lead support characters says, "But you're done, right? You're done with this Atlas, aren't you?" Questioning, and yet you keep going. The game recognizes you keep going. The characters that you fight in Slays are still revived in this endless cycle, gone completely mad. It's actually kind of a neat little story beat, the one I mentioned before, where the notion of kind of endless pursuit of power, it actually is one that keeps recurring in the game, endless pursuit of power. The final boss, the story mode, is a god of cannibalistic hunger. And isn't that just another form of just like, isn't that gluttony at the expense of others just basically what the greed of power is? And the cycle continues. These people that were more powerful than Godslayers become your nemesis. Maybe you'll be the next villain. They keep kind of going back to that too. One annoying thing about Path of Exile, though, is that... Ooh, that's actually really good. Is that the items that drop are so damn frequent, the pieces of gear you collect are so prevalent, that I'm not even showing all of them. And you have to write a darn text file, or more likely find a website where somebody made a comprehensive program to make one for you, to even comprehend all the loot that's dropping on the ground. Imagine playing this game with having to kind of fish out each piece of gear, not realizing what might be good or not. And that's a legitimate problem in Path of Exile. Hopefully they'll find a way to cull the amounts of ridiculous amounts of items that drop while still maintaining the notion that collecting items matter and deciding what you pick up off the ground does actually mean something. But is that a thing that's going to happen? Probably. Is it? And that'll be nice to see a change for. But it'll be a different game. And it goes back to the fact that Path of Exile is a living game. That leads to one kind of existential crisis thought. Nothing lasts forever. Hopefully Path of Exile will have a long life cycle, but what happens when it just doesn't make enough money to keep going? Maybe one of the developers, maybe the old guard retires and something new, and new people come in. This happens plenty of times in game franchises. Path of Exile is likely not to be an exception, though the people making it still play after all this time. Or still design their game. So the question is, what happens when the game dies? Will the servers just shut down? Will all this progress and collection be gone? Will they just hand the game over to the players? And that's, I think, a thing I lament most about Path of Exile. I worry about most. What's going to happen to the game? At some point, something's got to give. And I worry to see it go away. That's going to be long down the road, hopefully. But it is something maybe worth idly thinking about. Either way, Path of Exile, may it long live. May all this nonsense on the screen be played for more thousands of hours. I think it's a nice waste of time. This has been Trenot, and I hope that this ramble has been of some insight. Maybe there's some thought to be had here. We'll end off with the mechanic they literally added a month ago, in addition to changing out the way the whole atlas works. Build a boss. Where you choose what actions they actually cast and such. Like, it's ridiculous. This is a whole new thing they've added, just like this tiny little minigame. A very hectic minigame, but one nonetheless. Well, that's all for me. I'll have more to say about Path of Exile later, but for now, thank you for watching.